Hey folks, Randy Newberg here. We're recording this episode of Hunt Talk Radio, Leupold's Hunt Talk Radio, here in our office in Bozeman. We're going to have a really cool guest. A lot of you have seen him on our videos and other content. He hails from Southeast Alaska, Jim Baichtal. And a lot of you think of Jim as this jovial guy with a big bushy beard and walking around with his hawking. And that is all true. But what maybe some of you don't know is in Jim's retired life, he's become, well, he flunked retirement. He has been very, very active in Sitka Blacktail Deer Conservation. And the group that has helped him with a lot of that has been the Mule Deer Foundation. And you may have heard recently that the Sitka Blacktail Deer Foundation has become its own standalone thing, even though it's still under the umbrella of the Mule Deer Foundation. They've started a new group under the Mule Deer Foundation called the Blacktail Deer Foundation, Blacktail Deer Foundation. You can find out more at blacktaildeer.org. And Jim runs a lot of this stuff, and I think his official title, I wrote it down here, he is the regional coordinator in Alaska for the Sitka Blacktail Deer Foundation. And he supports pretty much all the activity that is happening in Alaska, but he's got a lot of help from people who do that. And Jim always wants to make sure everybody gets credit. Jim is not one of these guys who wants to be the center of the spotlight. So I asked Jim, well, starting from the top, the CEO, Greg Sheehan of the Mule Deer Foundation, all the way down, give me the names of the people who are helping you. So Steve Belinda, who some of you know him because he's the Chief Conservation Officer at the Mule Deer Foundation. And then there's a whole bunch of other people who are working in California, Washington, Oregon, really trying to get the Blacktail Deer Foundation off the ground. Scott Leorna, Randy Morrison, Ryan Krapp, Marshall Johnson, Josh Wesley, and Frank Gaither. All those people, Jim wants to make sure they all get the credit too because they're working hard to get this moving and rolling. And I think it's really interesting that another species, a subspecies at least, of the Blacktail deer family, mule deer and true blacktails, Columbia Blacktails and Sitka Blacktails, now will have its own group because the habitat needs are different. The way the species uses the landscapes are different. And being able to focus on that, I think, is going to do a better job for the true Columbia and Sitka Blacktail deer out here. So hopefully Jim makes it through this weather and is able to get here. We're waiting for him. But it's not like he's driving from Alaska. He drove over from, I think he flew to Seattle, if I remember right, and now he's driving from there. But if you know Jim, he'll do anything for the cause of conservation and the cause of blacktail deer. So if you want to find out more about it, go to blacktaildeer.org. And as quick as Jim gets here, me and him and Marcus are going to talk about blacktail deer. Thanks for being here. Well, folks, we told you that we had the world's most famous blacktail hunter here as our guest today, Jim Baichtal from Thorn Bay, Alaska, representing himself, representing all kinds of people who love blacktail deer, because you guys at the Mule Deer Foundation came up with the Blacktail Deer Foundation, Jim.
And I'm really glad they did.
Yeah. Tell us all about it. The inquiring minds want to know.
It's been like a dream of mine for dang near 20 years. And I think you and I first got together 2006, somewhere along in there after Ken Barrett introduced us.
Yeah.
And he also introduced me at that time to Steve Belinda, who was in the Theodore Roosevelt Conservation Partnership.
Yeah.
And so I went to the Tongass National Forest sent me to the expo. You remember the booth we used to have, talking about Sitka Blacktail deer, second growth habitat, opportunities for habitat and stuff like that. And I was kind of a pain in the Mule Deer Foundation's backside because the mission statement says the conservation of mule deer and blacktail deer and their habitat. And I said, so what can we do for blacktail?
Yeah.
And so I kind of kept these discussions up and stuff, and we made some inroads into getting things going in Southeast Alaska, but they never quite took root. You know, they just didn't quite find where they were going. And then I, after 30 some odd years, retired from the Forest Service and was happily retired. And I get a call from Steve Belinda one day, and so Joel Pedersen took over the CEO of the Mule Deer Foundation.
And Steve had moved over to the Mule Deer Foundation
Steve was
from
now
TRCP.
the Chief Conservation Officer. And Steve goes, we need you. And I go, what? And he goes, Joel wants to ramp up the thing on blacktail. And I went, oh my gosh, I was really enjoying my retirement, but I'm all in.
You flunked retirement,
I
Jim.
flunked retirement terribly. For a good cause, though, for a really good cause. And then so Leupold and Mule Deer Foundation put on a Blacktail Deer Summit in April of 2022 at the Leupold headquarters.
In Beaverton, Oregon, the core of Columbia Blacktail habitat.
Core of Columbia Blacktail, and they invited all of the agencies from Washington, Oregon, and Northern California. They had folks come down from Alaska. I was fortunate enough to actually be the first speaker to kick it off, which was really, really fun. And the energy that came out of that was, you know, when I got done with my discussion about the challenges that Sitka Blacktail have in Southeast Alaska, and then we had a kind of a discussion between all the agencies and the landowners and stuff. It's basically the same problems that there are from California to Washington
for Columbia Blacktails.
For Columbia Blacktail,
yeah,
it's habitat. You know, like what can we do for habitat? And we all have different challenges. They have. And also we talked a little bit about predation and stuff, and they have different suite of predators than we have up in Southeast Alaska, but the issues were basically the same issues.
Yeah.
Land ownership in Northern California and Oregon and Washington are completely different than the issues that we have in Southeast Alaska, where we basically have native land, Sea Alaska, and different corporation lands and Forest Service.
Yeah.
But the history of timber management is somewhat similar. We're still in primary timber harvest in Southeast Alaska, and they're on third or fourth rotation down in Washington, Oregon, and Northern California.
Yeah. Well, Marcus, you've shot a Sitka Blacktail.
No, I've never.
On Kodiak? Your dad and brother?
Just my brother killed one on Kodiak, yeah.
You were just there as a packer? This guy is really good at being a packer, Jim.
I've always appreciated him.
Yeah.
Everything that he's ever packed for me, I always am glad that Marcus is.
Yeah. Videographer, spelunker of karst caves.
That's right.
On accident, slipping into them with it. Hey, I didn't break the camera though. Just my face. I broke the fall with my face.
I remember the smiling face with the blood running down it as you held the camera up going, it's all right.
Yeah, I didn't drop the camera. It's great.
Oh, man. So, folks, what we're referring to is Jim, Marcus, and I, Tyler Jonathan, and Sophie Potter.
Sophie Gilbert. And Nick.
Yeah. And Nick.
Nick Schmuck.
Yeah. We were all on a really treacherous ridge in Southeast Alaska. You don't realize how treacherous it is because the vegetation hides all these karst caves and
all
stuff.
These vertical pits and sinkholes and fractures. And
well, and everything's wet, and that was the biggest. If you step on some wet vegetation on rock, and then it's just
you're gone.
Yeah, slip and down
we
you go.
were filming the film Reindeer, which is all about Sitka Blacktail deer. And Marcus is the last guy to cross because he's trying to film the crew going up. And quite honestly, when I crossed, if I would have known it was that treacherous, I probably wouldn't have crossed.
Right.
And I think I'm next I might have been either Tyler or I are in front of you. I can't remember. But all of a sudden I just hear, "Oh," and
he's gone.
Yeah, it's like one of these Hobbit shows or something where all of a sudden someone's gone. And we hear him sliding down through this chute that's covered in vegetation. And we hear a thunk, and I'm thinking to myself, oh no. My worst fear of a dead camera guy just happened. Because what do you suppose that was? 25, 30 feet you slid down there?
It was quick.
I don't know. It wasn't like straight down. It was, I mean, but there was a little bit of a fall involved.
But luckily, he used his face to slow his descent.
Yeah. And all we hear is, I'm like, "Marcus, are you okay?" And he's like, "I think so. The camera didn't get hurt." Is all he said.
All good.
And Tyler and I, we're both in panic mode. Tyler throws me his camera, and he starts scrambling down to get to you. And when he came up, you looked like you'd taken one for the team.
That was all good. It makes you realize how fast you can just slip on some of that stuff.
Yeah.
But my biggest fear was some of those pits are hundreds of feet deep.
Right.
Oh, right. Yeah. That could have been a lot worse for sure.
And you honestly don't know.
Yeah.
Yeah. And for people who don't know, it was a little spine where the pit came into that spine a lot closer than you could tell based on the vegetation. And Marcus is carrying a great big FX7.
Yeah, I'm trying to remember what it was. I think we had the FS7 at the time. Yeah.
Yeah. And it only weighs about an extra 20 pounds as it is. And then he always carries about a 60-pound pack of batteries and lenses and everything else. So, yeah, added a little more momentum in your descent.
But camera survived. It was good. And then,
yeah. Jim and Sophie
didn't lose any of that footage, which is good. I did lose a drone on that trip, though.
It's still up there.
Yeah. I really wanted to go try to find that, but Randy wouldn't let me.
Yeah, that was visibly treacherous, and there's no amount of footage or no drone that's worth scaling 1,000 feet of rock face and the slippery snot of Southeast Alaska.
With the possibility of not finding it anyhow.
Right. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. So, well, that'll be another story for another day of how that happened. But anyhow, maybe you could put out a reward for it. But then you'd have to tell people.
Well, yeah, I still have the GPS coordinates of where it went down.
Where it augured in.
Yeah. But anyhow, Jim, you've been so kind to let us tag along on some of these Southeast Alaska blacktail hunts. I've never hunted Columbia blacktails. Have either of you guys?
I have.
You have? You grew up in that
I grew up
country.
hunting Columbia blacktail in Mount St. Helens country and down in the valley along I-5 where I grew up. And then 2004, I drew that. And we used to also hunt the 100M, which is a late muzzleloading hunt for Columbia blacktail down in southwestern Oregon. And then in 2004, I went back and actually hunted on a guided hunt for Columbia blacktail down there, and I shot a giant.
Oh, yeah?
Yeah, that's like a 140
that's the
Columbia blacktail.
That's the one we have footage of down in the Jim Baichtal Natural History Museum.
Yeah.
Have you ever seen a more impressive
Oh, no, it's
house?
Incredible to look at Jim's taxidermy. It's pretty sweet. Yeah.
Since you've been there last, I've added the 4 African beasts on a nice pedestal mount and my New Zealand red stag.
Really? Man.
So,
all sorts of...
I guess.
And another buffalo, because I got our buffalo back.
Yeah.
I forgot that. I didn't have that down there when you.
Yeah, I mean, next thing we know, Jim's going to branch out into the North American Wood Bison Association or something. But
they actually are looking for volunteers right now to sit with them up on Minto Flats. You go up and you sign up for a week to go monitor them and make sure they're doing well.
In the wintertime?
In the wintertime.
Oh, wow.
You don't have enough love or money to get me to Minto Flats in the wintertime. You're like interior Alaska.
Yeah, it's like 50 below.
Yeah.
And there's usually a slight breeze.
Slight, yeah. So
maybe it's trying to do surveys throughout the winter.
No,
or
they
something?
actually have them kind of in this. I think it's a fenced enclosure.
Oh, interesting.
So to make sure they make it through the winter.
Gotcha.
and these are true wood buffalo, not plains bison.
That's correct.
Yeah, and not that we need to nerd out on that, because what's the primary difference between Columbia Blacktail and Sitka Blacktail? Because how far north do Columbia Blacktail go? Vancouver Island up
About
to
halfway up the British Columbia coast.
Okay.
And it's kind of a little fuzzy line there, and then above that are the Sitka Blacktail along the coast.
Okay. And how far? I mean, we always think of Southeast Alaska as that, but Kodiak has a bunch of them.
That was planted there in 1924. They started in 1925, and I think some other subsequent things. They actually caught them in Rocky Pass.
Okay.
You're very familiar with.
Yeah.
And that was the person that had the contract to do that had a little terrier, and they'd run him into the water, and he'd just swim up and grab him while they were swimming, and that's the way they captured it.
That's an interesting way to do it.
Yeah, and so, but anyhow, they moved him up there. There's a great photograph on, actually, if you go to my sitkablacktail.org webpage, I have a whole tab in there on translocations. And it's got a picture of that person on a dock in Sitka with a bunch of deer that the state uses on the front of their translocation brochure.
Wow.
So they planted them they planted Sitka Blacktail there. They put them in Prince William Sound. They put them at Yakutat. There was 4 or 5 other places they put deer that didn't take. But Kodiak was very successful.
Okay.
So you said the line's like a fuzzy line. Is it like kind of a gradient between? Because I feel like that's similar to moose when you have Shiras, Canada, Alaskan moose, right?
There's got to be some crossbreeding going on.
Okay.
And now too, so we are now out of the ice age, and the Cascades and the Coast Range are not that big physical barrier. So you must also have some mule deer influence in those. When I was a young man growing up, we would intentionally go up into the high Cascades to hunt what we called bench leg muleys, and they were Columbia Blacktail mule deer crosses.
Gotcha. And that's probably more of like an east to west gradient,
That east
right?
to west gradient, and a lot of the early bucks I shot field dressed between 225 and 240.
Wow.
But they had the small Columbia Blacktail rack.
Interesting.
Yeah, they were wonderful, huge deer body wise.
So, as far south then in California, whenever I see pictures of Columbia Blacktails in California, they look body size smaller than when I see these rutted up bucks from western Washington.
I think there's a lot of morphological change, and I don't know if it has to do with habitat and feed and those kind of things, but I know I was involved. I'm not sure what the range is for Columbia Blacktail. I know that the deer that I used to hunt when I was a young man, they were definitely field dressing in the 140, 150 range.
Yeah.
And that's the same as our Sitka Blacktail. I did was Boyd Porter at that time was the area biologist at Ketchikan, and he wanted to do that. And so he ran what he called just a deer, kind of a little deal where you bring any animal in, and we would take certain measurements and tissue and stuff off of that, and there was a prize at the end, a random drawing.
Yeah.
And but I did all the measurement of those, and there was any good 4-year-old or better Sitka Blacktail that was a 3.4 point, and somewhere in that vicinity was field dressing somewhere between 140 and 160, and we had a couple outliers that were above that. And I think at Petersburg they had one confirmed at like 190 field dress or something like that. And the biggest buck that I've ever killed body-wise, 3 days after I shot it, so it was hanging each night as I progressed down out of the Alpine and before I boated back to Thorn Bay. On certified scales in Thorn Bay, without bones in, just meat, I had 91 pounds of meat.
Oh, jeez.
That's a lot.
Yeah, I wonder what that translates to. Have you ever tried to compare?
Well, according to...
That's got to be a lot.
They kind of have a diagram of that, so they figured that his live body weight was between 270 and 300.
Wow. That's suey.
That's a big critter.
Suey pig.
Yeah, he's big.
Huh. Well, how's when you think about starting a new foundation, it's really not a new foundation. It's it's a part of the Mule Deer Foundation. Do I understand that correctly?
So Joel moved on, and Greg Sheehan come in, and I got a phone call one morning from Steve. He says, you need to get on this teleconference. And so we did a Teams or Zoom link, and Kelly Hepler was there, and Greg and Steve and I and a couple other folks, and Greg goes, I think I'd like to create the Blacktail Deer Foundation and use the model that they use for Pheasant Forever and Quail Forever. That all of the administration and stuff like that will stay with the Mule Deer Foundation, but this will give us a focused entity so that we can just really, really focus on blacktail deer across their range and both species. He said, what do you think? And I said, well, I'd promised Steve that I would give him 2 to 3 years on the Mule Deer Foundation when we started this thing in 22, and I was kind of getting back into my retirement mode, but I said, I'm all in. Because it's the right thing. It's when we started this thing, one of the folks that was a big driving thing when you and I first met in the late 2000s and stuff at that time was Dennis Neal. I don't know if you remember Dennis. I know Dennis met you. Dennis Neal and his wife Faith Duncan. Dennis was a life member of Mule Deer Foundation, and he was the public affairs office for the Tongass National Forest. And Dennis really he tried to get to be the Alaska representative for the Mule Deer Foundation, and he was getting ready to retire, and he wanted to take this to another degree. He was driven, man. He really wanted to take this. And so this was kind of his vision. It's why we had the booth down there at the expo.
Yep.
And it's why we were kind of carrying that message that here's a deer that not anybody knows very much about. Here's what's going on with him and that kind of thing. And he retired and got a brain tumor, and we've lost Dennis.
Darn.
So I kind of look at this as carrying on his legacy.
Yeah.
To me that this is really important to kind of pick up the reins and keep on going.
Yeah.
So,
well, I'm glad you guys are doing it. My goal someday is to go shoot a November Columbia Blacktail in Oregon or Washington, because just like in November when your Sitka Blacktails are in rut, they just are so striking. They're just big and bulked up, but the color that comes in, or the transition of their coat, is so striking. And someday I say I'm going to do that, but I'm getting older. I better get with the program.
I know. We're saving you a few November deer. You need to come up. You and I haven't done that yet.
I know we haven't. But when you took Jim Heffelfinger and Marcus, all it did was rain.
It did rain, but we had some beautiful days up on top. I think the best moment of that is when we were doing our exit interview, and I looked over Heffelfinger's shoulder after I'd called for 15 minutes before we did that, and there was a buck walking up behind Heffelfinger, and I told him, I said, Jim, there's a buck behind you. He goes, yeah, right. And he kept looking at Marcus and I'm looking at the buck walking up behind him, and I said, no, there's really a buck behind you.
If you would have killed that thing during the interview, that would have been the most epic end to a hunt ever. Because we were like done. We're like, well, that's it. We're all done. We better do an interview and head back. And it almost happened.
And you saw it too. Jim hunts in the desert Southwest.
Right.
And he goes, my entire thing is I sit on top of a ridge, see a deer a mile and a half away and figure out how to go get it. And as you're walking up on it, it's not crunching on the gravel on the desert, and here we're out in this rain. He was so out of his element.
Right.
And for, I don't know, 20 years, he'd been making decisions in the Mule Deer Working Group on habitat decisions for all blacktail deer, and he'd never been in that environment. Yeah. And to watch his wonderment and soaking it all in, literally.
Yeah.
But I mean, it was just fun to watch that. And then he came back 2 years after that and brought Levi,
his son.
And I called in 4 does and 2 bucks up in a meadow, and he shot a really beautiful 5x5, 4x4 with eye guards, just a gorgeous buck and stuff like that. And Levi, he sent me, he just got it on his wall.
Cool.
Taxidermy's back. So.
Yeah. Wow.
But just to watch Jim's wonderment, and he goes, this means so much to me to get a better understanding of what this habitat is like and the challenges that these deer are facing on that landscape. And
which kind of gets us to the point of, any of the foundations. I don't care if it's Mule Deer Foundation, Elk Foundation, Ducks Unlimited. A lot of people think that you guys just throw water on the landscape as like an add water and mix thing, and all of a sudden there should be some deer or some elk or some ducks around. It really does come to habitat for the most part.
That's all about, and that's absolutely what we're focused on. And we've been able to get 4 projects with the Forest Service on the Tonga, spread between Prince of Wales Island, up by Tenakee on Chichagof Island, and over out of Ketchikan in older second growth, working with the wildlife biologists. I think there's a total of about 2,000 acres that we were getting ready to treat and stuff like that. We're on hold a little bit with questioning about where we're at with that funding right now, being on hold in the federal government.
Yeah.
We hope to get that laid out this year and maybe award the contracts this fall, and then do the work, start the work next year. But we're looking at, like, across Southeast Alaska, not all deer herds are equal. The deer herd in Unit 4, which is Advocacy, Chichagof, and Baranof, is doing really well. They haven't had a bad winter since 2011. And I'm starting to see really older age class bucks coming out, even out of Sitka. I'm starting to see some big 4x4s, which you never saw that kind of stuff out of Sitka before. The deer have rebounded around Hoona. They were greatly reduced in Hoona with that winter and stuff. And so there's been hearing really positive things about that deer herd. The deer herd on Kuyu, Mitkoff, and Kupernoff Island, in 1972, there was a bad winter. June 1st, there was 6 feet of snow on the beach on Kuyu.
Wow.
And they virtually, for all intents and purposes, wiped the deer completely off the face of the earth.
Yeah.
So for years, there was no season on Unit 3, and it slowly built. They've slowly been building their stuff, and then they went to 1 week, and I think then they went to 2 weeks, if I remember the equation right. And now they're Tessa, who's the new deer biologist for ADF&G, is continuing a pellet count and camera trap to try to estimate populations, and they're really amazed at how many deer they see. Where you found that great big skull that's like, what, number 2 non-typical in the world or something like that.
Yeah.
It's right in there. I've had others up along that same Rocky Pass area and stuff that I've scored as a Boone and Crockett scorer and stuff, and we're seeing a big expansion of deer across that landscape. Finally, after how many years is that? Since 72, 60 years, over 60 years.
Yeah.
So, Ketchikan and Unit 1 is doing really well. My gosh, they're getting some incredible bucks and numbers of bucks out of that thing. Unit 2, where I live out there, the deer numbers are down, and it's definitely struggling, and it's not because of bad winters. There's a combination of things going on a little bit. For a while there, the Alexander Archipelago wolf was being petitioned to be listed, and Alaska Department of Fish and Game on Unit 2 was walking a fine line of what could be trapped and what couldn't be trapped annually, while still keeping a trapping season going. And so there was some big fluctuations in the wolf population out there based on what trappers were taking and not trapping. They were anywhere from 60 to, I think, 160 that were taken out in a year. So that's kind of got back to a level playing field now. And I guess I have to put it in terms of my own experience on that island out there. When I first got there, you couldn't believe the number of deer. And I truly think that our deer population on Prince of Wales right now is at least half of what it was then, maybe 2/3 of what it was then. That it's greatly diminished. And the only thing that's really changed, and I have to also digress back, we also had tons of bear. And one of the things that's come out of some of the studies, I helped Sophie with her study, and then I helped 2 or 3 other ADF&G studies where we put collars on fawns, that in the first 2 weeks of those fawns' lives, black bears take 50% of the fawns.
Wow.
Like I think hers was, out of 150 fawns, black bear took 48% of them or something like that.
Wow.
Is what she. So we now have much fewer black bear, only they are finally increasing after being at their lowest number in 2004 and 5. And we saw that when we were out on that bear hunt we were on. Yeah. And we're starting to see that age class. And we're starting to see the older age class coming back in, which I'm super excited about.
For bears you're talking about.
Yeah. So we have the bear numbers slightly increasing. The wolf seem to be pretty much stable in their number, and really the only thing that's changed is now all of those all of that timber managed units that used to be great forage as long as it wasn't dead of winter are growing up, and they're in what we call stem exclusion phase. No light gets to the forest floor. Marcus, you and I went in with Jim and a bunch of those stands and filmed that stuff.
Right, yeah. I was hoping you could kind of break, for the people listening who might not have seen those videos, like, can you break down like how it got to that point? Like what is ideal Sitka blacktail habitat, or like what do they need for their winter range? I guess to break it down, what are the habitat challenges that are, or why are you at the situation that you are now?
So when a clear cut is formed or some kind of timber management is formed, about 2 or 3 years after that, the bloom of mainly blueberry and huckleberry species, which is the primary deer food, the vacciniums, is incredible in there. And, and there is unbelievable amounts of food, except for there's no canopy to capture the snow if we get deep snows. So they're limited in their ability to access that food by how deep the snow gets in the winter. But a clear cut goes through a progression where those trees grow up and it starts shading things out. In somewhere between 15 and 20 years, roughly, the agency or a private landowner usually goes in and pre-commercially thins. So it's natural regeneration. Nobody's gone and planted anything. There's too many stems per acre. And they go in there and remove that to a spacing, some kind of a predetermined silvicultural spacing on those trees. And that leaves all that slash on the ground. Well, the forage rebounds. It creates forage for deer, but they can't access it because of the slash load. And we saw some of that stuff too.
It looks like a punji pit in some of those areas.
God, it's terrible.
Yeah.
You can't wade through it with a D8 cat.
Right.
Then that continues to grow until the tree's branches intertwine to the point, and then all of that slash rots down, and it's a little bit of a layer on the ground that won't hold your weight any longer. And the trees continue to grow and grow and grow, and virtually no light gets to the forest floor. So where there used to be abundant forage for 20 years of that timber harvest life, there is none. What we saw? We saw mosses and lichens and mushrooms. I mean, that's all it was. And there were deer trails through it where they were going from forage to forage place, but they may bed along the edges. So it makes really good thermal cover, but if they get caught in there in the winter, there's nothing to eat. So they need to be able to get from wherever they're living on the landscape as the snows increase to, I guess, about 18 inches. So that's a brisket depth. And once they start having to push through that takes so much energy, they try to get out of that situation. And they need to be able to get to where there's forage. Well, some of the steeper slopes, even though that's maybe not the best forest, there's enough canopy interception in that because of the angle of the slope and the way the branches of the primary forest that's on there is, you still have great forage. So you have some interception. But if it gets really deep snow in those medium to higher elevations, let's say 500 to 2,000 feet elevation, they need to be able to come down. So they need conductivity. They have to be able to get from where they're at to where they need to go to have thermal cover and forage. So you need some situation where they can get out of the snow, or the snow is caught by the canopy.
Right.
But there's still some food underneath there. You need that salad bowl for them to be able to access that.
Right. So you have the old growth is providing that big canopy, good thermal cover for them, but then all that second growth. So when they come in and thin that, so I guess in an ideal situation, you would, like when you did the pre-commercial thinning, then you would remove a bunch of that slash. Is that primary? Would that be the ideal situation?
Ideal situation would be you'd go in and create a corridor.
Okay.
You're gonna have to open a corridor. You can herringbone off of that. fall the trees into those corridors, bring the entire tree out. Use a processing head on the landing to take all the limbs off, cut the log size and stuff, because all this is nothing wrong with that. In fact, there's very little defect in that second growth. And then take those limbs, use the limbs and stuff for biomass, and take the woods and make dimensional lumber out of it.
Yeah, because we went and looked at a few sites where you guys, or where, everybody collectively had done these habitat projects, but it was on, they were how many acres on a massive landscape, right? So that's the hard part.
So I look at this as a scalar thing, that there's been some incredible work done by the Nature Conservancy in a few places that the Forest Service has done this across the landscape. But we have like 360,000 acres of this. And if you do the math, that the estimates between 15 and 20 deer per square mile is what the possibility is, you can pretty well figure out there's 6,000 or 8,000 deer that's not there.
Yeah. Huh.
And so our hopes is eventually it's going to have to be a paradigm shift for the management strategy on the landscape. In a perfect Jim Baichtal world, we'd be doing a habitat restoration economy where you're going to have to do some large scale timber management, because we have to have a industry that's a viable second growth industry to keep the roads open, the culverts in place, the bridges in place, and the infrastructure so that you can go do the habitat work. Because you don't want to take habitat dollars if you start doing road building with habitat dollars, you're not going to do any acres on habitat because it's going to eat it all up. And so I'd love to be able to see that become the impetus for the management strategy on the landscape. We are going to produce logs out of there, and they're huge volumes of logs because the density is so high in those stands. There's still a lot of trees per acre with very little defect in there. But one of the big projects that's being worked on, it was a contract put out by the Mule Deer Foundation through the Forest Service, through our agreement with the Forest Service right now, is you've got this, what I call the canvas, 360,000 acres. Actually, they're looking Tongass wide, so it's way bigger than that. Where should we do the work? Not all that landscape's created equal. You don't need to treat it all. Some of it is actually open enough. It's got boughs underneath there, so you don't need to do anything. How about those southwest facing slopes and mid elevation? How can we look at the mosaic of the habitat that's left on there and the corridors that exist, and where should we focus our efforts? So there's places that we could definitely enhance the availability of forage and make it accessible to those deer. And so it's a huge mapping project. I think that'll be done in August. Using LIDAR, how the winds move across the landscape, where are riparian management opportunities, because we could combine this work with providing large wood to restore habitat in the streams where the large wood had been removed years ago by the logging practices that were in the early 60s and stuff. So that first question is to say where on the landscape level, and try to figure that out, and then figure out what do those prescriptions look like and what can we do for the deer. And right now we have one larger mill that is tooled up for doing old growth. It's not tooled up for doing second growth. We have several really great manufacturers that are interested in young growth, and they have kilns and they're making dimensional lumber and other product out of that. But if you're going to make an impact on hundreds of thousands of acres, you have to treat 4,000 or 5,000, 6,000 acres a year, or you're never going to get ahead of the curve.
Yeah. Yeah. And a lot of people think this is just, so easy, but when you lose the infrastructure for utilizing that, you lose the infrastructure of the roads, and that's a whole nother issue. But also just the mills, the loggers, you have to have it at a scale that's profitable for them by either the utilization of the timber, or you pay them as.
That's right.
It's the same as you'd pay somebody to go manage. This is a simplification, but go spray weeds on a cattle pasture.
That's exactly right.
You got to make it somehow workable and profitable for them, or the entire infrastructure gets focused on, all right, where's the profitable area? And if that's just old growth, that's not going to provide the infrastructure you need for that habitat manipulation.
So there has been several large, usually clear-cut second growth timber sales on the Tongass National Forest, and that most of that's been exported directly overseas.
Yeah.
And what we're hoping to do is get primary manufacture locally, but the infrastructure isn't there. And the agencies are saying, well, we don't have any place to make this sale go to on the Tongass yet. And we're saying, but if you don't let investors know that there's X amount of wood available, they're never going to go get the capital to put those kind of investments into Southeast Alaska to start that.
Yeah.
So it's kind of a chicken and an egg question on the whole dang thing, you know, and the Sitka Blacktail are caught in the middle.
Right.
And so what we have today is reduced habitat, and of course we have pretty stable wolf populations and increasing bear populations. Well, they're in that same habitat. That's where we go and hunt and stuff, and so it's just compressing what's left into smaller and smaller blocks. And I know that there's a lot of folks that are very passionate about intensive management with the predator stuff, but I really hold that if you have good quality intact habitat that's accessible to those animals, the predators have an impact, but it's not a negative impact on that population.
Yeah. I don't care what species you study. If you look at habitat quality and the effects of predation, every species out there, there's a correlation between, all right, we got high quality habitat, the impacts of predation are far less. We have low quality and marginal habitat, the impacts of predation are amplified and are a lot higher. That's
Yeah.
Yep.
I don't know if there's any study that's ever been contrary to that relationship.
And that's what we're in right now, you know, and it sadly, it doesn't look good for the years that I've got left to chase these things. But I would hope that through the efforts of the Blacktail Foundation and the Blacktail Deer Foundation and the Mule Deer Foundation that we can start to make a change, to change that paradigm in management, basically, both on private land and agency land and stuff. And that may be driven from the public, because
Right.
the last 2 years was the first time that I started hearing people in Thorn Bay and other communities say, I'm not getting the deer I need to fill my freezer.
Yeah. And that's, I think, those of us in the lower 48, we don't realize what the subsistence value of deer and other species are in places like Alaska and the far north of Canada. They don't care about, oh, this has got to be a record book animal. They're like, how many of these can I get in my freezer
That's
today?
exactly right. You know, and to actually hear people say that for the first time. So as roads grow in and roads are shut, access is going down. And one of the big things that we're saying, that if we open these roads up and we do these treatments in there, we want these roads to stay open so people have access to where we've hopefully put deer back on the landscape.
Yeah.
You know, and that's going to go right into that freezer.
Yeah. And, coming from the lower 48, the more arid part of the Rockies, roads don't grow in. It takes decades for roads to grow in here. So the worry of that is not that great here. But you get to more temperate environments, starting at northwest Montana, northern Idaho, along the coast of Oregon, Washington, California, Alaska. Those roads grow in quickly where you can't get through it. And I know that a lot of people want to think that all landscapes, all roads, all this is the same. Even they'll say, oh, well, just let fire take care of it. When's the last time you've had a landscape-altering fire in southeast Alaska?
The best that I can tell was about 7,800 years ago.
Yeah.
So from a lot of the work that I've done in sediments and lake cores and all that kind of stuff as a geologist there, we had fire in our ecology from about 11,000 years to 7,800 years ago. It was actually warmer than it is today.
Yeah.
We had colder winters and drier summers and fire in the ecology.
Right.
You know,
But not now.
but not now.
And so when people say, well, just let nature take care of it, that's not going to happen.
I've got a spot that I love to hunt And I go up every year and spend 8 to 14 hours with a brush saw and a chainsaw, keeping my road open up to a spot and it's growing in with alder and spruce and hemlock so fast. I'm doing the road maintenance on that thing to keep it passable.
Yeah. So there's all those challenges, and we've been talking a lot about the area where you live, Jim, but I travel to shows. Like I just got back from a show in the Seattle area where Blacktail deer are still a big deal there. And then you look at going south to Oregon, California. They have had a lot of fire recently in some of that blacktail habitat there. And we're talking in the last 5 years that's a major fire there. It's going to be interesting to see how fire alters those landscapes, whether it's public or private, because a lot of that's been on timberland, private timberland ground. A lot of it's been on Forest Service ground. It'll be interesting to see how that alters.
There's a huge historical thing you can read up on called the Tillamook Burn. And the Tillamook Burn happened on the Oregon coast. I can't, if it was 30s or 40s. When I was a young man growing up in southwestern Washington, it was legendary for the size of the body on the deer. The browse that came back and the availability of forage over there and the fact that you could hunt this gigantic coastal area that burned over there. But everybody knew in conversations between hunters that the size of those blacktail deer, because of the availability of forage, was so huge out there in the Tillamook Burn that it was legendary. So we might see that same kind of thing come back.
Wow. I guess, Marcus, if we're doing Columbia Blacktail, let's get on that.
I know. I'd like to go try it someday. It's just totally out of my wheelhouse. Have no idea what to expect, but it'd be a fun adventure
honestly,
to just go out and try
one
to
of the
figure it out.
primary hunts that there is that 100M. It's a late November, first part of December rut hunt for Columbia Blacktail in southwestern Oregon, and that's where a lot of the really beautiful big bucks, as you start seeing bucks you never see.
Wow. Isn't that a muzzle?
It's a muzzleloader.
Yeah, see, so Jim's already got, he's rat holing all of his ideas and thoughts for those crazy muzzleloader guys who walk around. And people who watch our content know that Jim walks around with an old Hawken that looks
My wife say I hunt with museum pieces.
yeah, there you go. Whereas I'm never going to be walking around with that, so I got to find a different place and a different season, because I don't think there's very many seasons, at least in Oregon and Washington, where you can rifle hunt in the rut.
No, there's not.
So I think
there's some archery opportunities.
Oh, really?
Well, and I know a lot of guys do tree stands, and they'll find travel corridors, but I don't know how your patients are.
Mine's no good. A company sent me a bunch of tree stands one time. They're like, you should really try these. And these were, I'm not a tree stand hunter, so I had no idea that these tree stands were of that quality. And when I had my come and get it event, where every few years it's like, all right, just show up and make a donation to a nonprofit group and pick what you want here. That's where those tree stands ended up. Was some lucky guys got them at the come and get it event for $20.
I have taken one Sitka Blacktail out of a tree stand.
Really? Huh. Marcus, have you ever hunted out of a tree stand?
A little bit. I've shot a couple white-tailed does out of tree stands, but that's about it.
I've never hunted out of a tree stand.
And I got to tell you, this last 2 years, I have one set of cameras that between about the 18th of November and Thanksgiving, every single day there is nearly a Boone and Crockett buck walk by those cameras in the daylight, and I am seriously thinking about hanging it.
Huh.
And I'm going to be there 4 or 5 days, and then it's going to happen.
Yeah.
But
well, you tell me when that is, and when you got those tree stands hung up, it might be my first time ever.
Actually, if you go to my YouTube channel that I got, I'm just posting some of the stuff that I get on trail cameras. You can go take a look at a couple of these bucks.
I know you sent me some of those videos. They're whoppers.
Oh, they're whoppers.
Yeah. Huh.
So I also have been volunteering for the state of Alaska to do their hairboard nodes for their wolf study that they've got going on.
Hairboard nodes. What the heck is that?
So they have 200 spots across the Unit 2.
Yeah.
They have 5 boards at each node that have 3 strands of barbed wire on it. And then you put lure on those in hopes that when the pack of wolves go by, a certain percentage of that pack will rub.
Up against that
And
wire.
then, right, and then you pick up the hair. We all go out. We have collection kits and gloves and alcohol, and we work on being really I don't like throwing extra beard hair in.
Yeah, so alcohol, not like in consumptive alcohol.
No.
Yeah.
And so we pull the hair off that and put it in little bags and document all that. And then that goes to the genetics lab. And they take a look at what species, how many are out there and sex and stuff. But it can also act as a recapture thing, because then wolves are being trapped at that same time, and tissue samples are taken out of those animals, and they can compare those genetics. Like, I got that wolf happened that he just trapped. I got back up in Thorn River on node 21. Anyhow, there's one set of nodes that go back in 8 miles, and there's 3 nodes, and it takes the technician an entire day to do that. And I hunt that all the time. And so I went to Ross and I said, let me volunteer to do that node set. So I run those nodes, and I very carefully don't take a firearm while I'm running those nodes. And I was going to check those nodes the other day, and that buck that I sent you the picture of was standing in the middle of the old trail at 10 yards.
Wow.
Steam just humming off of his body. The snow was there, and he just looked at me, and he just turned and walked slowly down the road 40 yards, looked at me again, and went into the timber.
Wow.
Oh, my God.
It's like they know. They're like, he's not hunting me right now.
Yeah.
I
That's
got
fine.
him. He probably saw me coming and waited.
Yeah.
So does the Blacktail Deer Foundation have the equivalent of a gym somewhere in Washington, Oregon, or California?
Yeah, we've got both conservation officers and people who are working to build. So we're trying to build chapters.
Yeah.
We have a really active chapter at Kodiak. Now, we're not going to improve habitat on Kodiak.
Right.
Habitat on Kodiak's doing just fine with what's there. We're not going to enhance it. But what we did was we partnered with Alaska Department of Fish and Game, and they have a long-term camera trap and radio telemetry study going on. And we've been able to, through chapter awards, to help those guys achieve what they want. And they're going to get a bunch of volunteers to go check cameras and pull cards for them and replace batteries, and so they could actually go further afield by using the Blacktail Deer chapter participants in that. So we did we've signed up folks and did the agreement, so they make sure that they don't hold anybody liable for getting hurt when they're doing things out there and all that kind of stuff. And that's a really cool possibility. And we got chapters in Sitka. We got Prince of Wales Island, starting one in Ketchikan, Juneau. I think we got one in Palmer, Wasilla, Anchorage. We need to go to Fairbanks. We've been having requests. So, and they're, Fairbanks and Palmer and Wasilla and Anchorage, they don't have blacktail deer around there.
Right.
But it's a pretty big thing for those people to go to Kodiak or come to Southeast Alaska or Prince William Sound and hunt Sitka blacktail deer once a year.
Yeah.
So there's been really good response. One of the biggest things that I think is in having the Blacktail Deer Foundation and having it focused on that. When I go into a group, I don't have to spend a half hour explaining why the Mule Deer Foundation is interested in helping, even though it's in their mission statement and always has been since 1988, that I don't have to do that explanation of why the Mule Deer Foundation is here, because now the Blacktail Deer Foundation is here, and that's pretty intuitive.
Yeah. So the similar things you just rattled off in Alaska is the goal to have that happening in Oregon, Washington, California, possibly. Do you guys do anything in British Columbia, or is
We'd like to. Right now, we don't.
Okay.
There's been some interest by folks on Vancouver Island. They have exactly the same situation with habitat. There, they have the same predator suite, adding mountain lions.
Oh, that's right. Yeah.
And so, I mean, now you have to take that into account. And there's a lot of mountain lion predation on Columbia Blacktail deer.
Yeah.
We just had a genetic study done. So, I've worked in the caves and studied in the caves for years and years and years, and we have thousands of blacktail or deer carcasses in the caves. And we had 3 that dated older than 7,000. 2 out of caves and 1 out of a shell midden. So the first evidence of blacktail or deer being hunted on an outlying island off of Prince of Wales Island, Hecate Island, came out of a shell bin out there.
What is that?
So where there would have been a village, and they take their waste charcoal and shells from dinner and stuff, and they throw it out and make a pile.
Okay.
In that was a bone that the archaeologists identified as a caribou bone. But when we looked at it, I said, I think that might be deer. And we had a person doing genetics on that. So they found out that the early deer, everything that predates 7,000 that got to Prince of Wales Island, at about 9,500 years ago, the first one showed up. So during that fire in the ecology period, and we were transitioning from a herb-dominated tundra to a hemlock spruce forest at that time. Those deer were blacktail, Sitka blacktail, but they had mitochondrial DNA from mule deer. So there was a little bit of crossbreeding on that first batch that ever came out there. Everything we've got from the caves that is then younger than 7,000 is strictly Sitka blacktail. So it's still kind of trying to figure out where they come from. I know Jim Heffler, our good friend, and Emily Latch did that paper where they defined what blacktail were from mule deer and the genetics of that stuff, and that it was the glaciation of the Pleistocene, so 2.5 million years of isolation. But we don't, and that as you move from California north, I believe they become more strongly blacktail as you move north into Washington. But where was that refugia? Where was that population that eventually became a Sitka blacktail? I don't think we've exactly defined that.
So people who don't know, Jim spent his career as a geologist for the Forest Service, and everyone's going to want to become a geologist for the Forest Service when they find out that was your job, and you got to go and dig around in caves and find all kinds of artifacts and, the things you did on shorelines, and you helped so many studies related to this stuff. That's why you're so well versed in it.
Yeah, it was really wonderful. And I covered everything from Yakutat to Ketchikan, which is like the entire panhandle of Alaska, which is so big, like I think I only saw like 5% of it in 35 years.
Yeah.
It's like so huge.
So
thousands of islands.
If there's any young people who think crawling around in caves on islands of Alaska and retrieving all kinds of skulls and bones and other just
working with
artifacts.
the paleontologists over those years, Dr. Timothy Heaton was the primary person that we worked with, working out of that. I delivered his bone collection to Fairbanks. There was 57,000 specimens.
Wow.
Now, some of those were individual microtine teeth. So that's the cool thing when you get all of these sediments and stuff. You get all the voles and shrews and mice and stuff, and they actually tell you way more about lemmings. Lemmings. They tell you way more about the climate than the large mammals that can survive in many different climate settings and stuff like that. But
Wow.
It's wild.
Yeah, and we've been the beneficiary of it. We just get to skim off the top of Jim's knowledge and stomping around. And
I remember sitting on a beach showing you those fishing weirs.
Oh yeah, I would have never picked that out. But yeah, it's just like once you point it out, it's really cool. Like just.
And we don't know if that was for catching salmon that were schooling or were in the spring where they laying boughs in those to collect the herring eggs.
Oh,
eggs on boughs, which is they do it yet today.
Yeah, they still do that. I had Heather and Mike DeVille on this podcast a couple times, and that's one of their traditional food sources is they go set evergreens out in the ocean and let the herring spawn on them.
There's actually a herring egg on kelp fishery.
Yep.
So they have what's called pounds, which are these floating things, and they hang the fronds down in a netted pin. They go out and seine up a bunch of herring and put them into a pin, and they pull those two pins together, and then they take them from this pin into that pin, and I think they give them red wine and play music. But anyhow, they lay about a 1/4 inch of eggs on that kelp frond. That's a very carefully cleaned and selected kelp frond.
Yeah.
And then that is cut into strips and salted, and that's the product.
Oh, interesting.
And actually, it's wonderful to eat. Just virtually the salted eggs on that kelp. That's really, really good.
So herring eggs dried on kelp.
No, they're not dried.
Well,
It's
I know,
salted.
but when you eat it,
Well,
though,
yeah. Well, actually, when we ate it right off the pound there. We just cut it off, and they were fresh eggs, fresh raw eggs on a thin piece of kelp.
really, like
And they kind of pop in your mouth, and they're chewy, and they're good.
herring caviar.
That's kind of what
Nice.
it was.
You better quit bragging about this, Jim, or the population of Thorn Bay is going to quadruple in the next couple of years.
I don't know about that.
Well, maybe in their minds until they go there and put up with the weather this time of year. And
I always tell people when they come in the summer and it's beautiful and sunny and everything else, and like we did not have that on that one hunt with you, but I've actually had some pretty good. Our bear hunt was a gift.
Yeah.
Well, ironically, when we came up to film reindeer, Tyler and I flew out early because we wanted to get a bunch of B-roll of, the
was
rainforest, and we wanted to film rain and, how dreary it can be, and it was just beautiful. Those 2 days that we were supposed to film that, it was sun was shining, wasn't hardly a cloud in the sky, but then we got the full rain experience eventually. That was.
I tell people come back in October.
Yeah.
If you can survive October.
Yeah. Well, I've been on 2 Sitka Blacktail hunts up there. The one where I shot the buck right out of my tent, hardly rained at all on that hunt.
Remember we had to get down.
Yeah.
Because it was coming.
Right. Yeah. You got the message saying
Yeah.
from whoever
the storm that we thought was going to be another day later, giving us a little more relaxing time, accelerated coming in, and we had to pretty much throw his deer in a pack and mine in a pack and get our buns down off that mountainside.
Yeah. We got out of there in time, though. And then when we got to your house, it rained so hard that I think Tyler and I had to take the ferry
You did.
back to Ketchikan.
They weren't flying.
Yeah. And then when Marcus joined us on the hunt when we were filming reindeer, you guys, like you said, Marcus, you guys went up a couple days early to get all the rain footage.
Right.
And then we had 1 or 2 beautiful days, and then the heavens opened up.
Oh, my God.
And I remember just laying in my tent. It's like, I wonder how many hours a guy can lay in his tent and not have to pee.
Yeah. Well, I remember, I'm sure Jim has experienced this numerous times, but it was my first time where, I just remember having anything that was dry just continued to shrink, throughout that trip. Because at first, inside your tent is still dry.
The ever-shrinking aura of dryness.
Yeah. And so it's just your clothes are getting wet, but it's like, okay, I can go back to my tent and my sleeping bag is still dry. And everything just kept getting more and more saturated to the point where it's like I had nothing to dry off the camera with. There was nothing that I had that was dry.
Yeah.
The only way you could kind of get dry is stand next to the fire for a little bit.
Yeah.
And then you turn around and dry off your backside. And by the time that was kind of dry, then
you guys
your front side was wet again. And so it's you couldn't do anything. And I just remember I remember trying to wipe off the camera. I was like, there's nothing to wipe it off with anymore. Everything I have is saturated.
Well, 98% humidity will do that.
Oh, God, that was so wet. We thought about you guys and that was a bold move you guys made to try to make that happen in that dang rain on top of that.
Oh, with
mountain.
Tyler, yeah, that was a crazy day. That was definitely a memorable day.
He had just seen that probably like a 112, 115
Right.
Sitka Blacktail.
Yeah.
Beautiful
Yeah.
record book archery blacktail.
Yeah.
Well,
That was it was a worthwhile experience for sure. Go up there, but it never stopped raining. It just kept going the whole time. And
It's when all bodies are back on the beach and nobody got hurt. Seriously, thank God, because that coming down through that forest.
Oh yeah.
yeah, if you want to call it a forest, it needs a new term to define it. It's steepness, slime, rock.
A lot of Devil's Club.
The Devil's Club stink current salmonberry thicket over the wind-thrown trees.
Yeah.
with that weird limestone topography bedrock thing sticking out underneath it.
Yeah.
Yeah, that had I was thinking that there were just millions of slugs here that I'm stepping on because that's how slimy and slippery it is. I don't know how many times I fell on my butt, but they need to make rain gear with a butt pad in it, so an elbow pad, so when you fall, you don't get as bruised up.
I had to send my that Stormfront Sitka gear in to have them patched. On that walk down, evidently I had fallen through. When I went to change my clothes, I had blood on my underwear. And I thought, well, where the hell did that come from? And I had a hole in my butt that went through the.
Really?
I didn't even feel it coming down with that load of meat on,
Yeah.
Jeez.
Well, I feel really lucky, Jim, because in this is a lot of, I guess, if you go hunt a new landscape, you want to go with someone who's been there, done that, and no one has been there, done that more than you have. So I've shot one Sitka Blacktail, and it makes the the record book, which is embarrassing to think about. I've not entered it. I've had it officially scored, and I just haven't got around to entering it. But that was very kind of you to shoot the one you did.
See, I think it's interesting, Marcus. He still thinks fondly of me after dragging him up and down that hill twice.
It's pretty incredible experience, though. Just overall, it's very cool.
Yeah.
I remember when we were taking a break on the first time, not on the reindeer thing. Randy says, well, how many bucks you think we're going to see? And I said, there's going to be 20 or 30 bucks. Yeah, no, we ain't going to see that. We walked out. I think there was 22 bucks on that face,
Yeah.
Randy goes, oh, my God.
Yeah. If ever I've been to a wildlife, like Garden of Eden, that was it.
Remember, Sophie walked out, and she said that her definition of the perfect salad bowl had just been polled.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting. But on both those trips, when we got to the place that you really wanted to show us what alpine habitat can be at its prime, both times the weather was beautiful. Right, you like walk out, you step out of this wall of trees.
It says, "Come on in."
Yeah,
Lures you in.
Yeah, lures you. That's probably the right term. But I'm happy that the Mule Deer Foundation is doing this because in today's world, we've become less generalists and more specialists, and I don't mean that in a bad way. It's just that people really get into certain things. It used to be. Okay, my dad or my grandfather's generation, yeah, I'm a hunter. Well, then 30 years ago, it's like, oh, I'm an archery hunter, or I'm a rifle hunter, or I'm a muzzleloader hunter, and now I'm an archery elk hunter. I'm an archery Rocky Mountain elk hunter, or I'm really into people would associate you with being a traditional muzzleloader Sitka Blacktail hunter, and I think if we can give the attention to these species, because they have such different habitat demands, the variety of the landscape, just in blacktail deer, when you take Sitka Blacktails versus Columbia Blacktails, the land ownership pattern with the old railroad grants and timberland grants that
ONC
happened.
lands.
Yeah, what does that stand for, ONC?
Oregon, California, I think, ONC.
Was it a railroad?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. So that's what created the checkerboard in Oregon and California, because a lot of people think the checkerboard is just a Wyoming kind of Rocky Mountain thing, but
you could go look at Onyx in Southern Oregon.
Yeah,
it's virtually every section is different. Every other section.
Yeah, and people who don't know, back when the country was being settled, the timber companies, the mining companies, and the railroads were granted a lot of land to go develop it and get resources out of these wild lands. And one of the incentives to get them to do that was to give them every other section that looks like a checkerboard. I wish they would have just gave them blocks of land and then...
There's been discussions about doing consolidation.
Yeah.
But you have to be legislated consolidation and stuff like that. But, making it equitable across the board would be really tough.
Yeah, it also requires a lot of money to solve that problem, and I don't know that that's going to happen anytime soon. But that's not an issue that the wild lands of the Tongass or the Chugach in Alaska really have that issue. No. But you get to the lower 48 and you see that. You see a lot of private commercial timber harvest in those lands of blacktail habitat, the Columbia Blacktails. And no one can really tell a private timber company, oh, this is how you got to manage your habitat. I mean, some of them will do it, and there's times when their habitat will be beneficial to deer, but as forests change and grow and evolve over their cycle of harvest, what's the harvest cycle on most of the coastal range stuff in Oregon, Washington?
I don't know,
50
because a
years?
lot of that stuff now has been planted, and some of that Weyerhaeuser and other land ownerships has got some genetically modified trees, and they're at like 35, 40 years.
Wow.
Oh, wow.
Where, on the Tongass, we are like 100, 150 years probably, depending on when you harvest and stuff. So we're a lot slower growing.
Yeah. So that evolution of the forest from its regeneration from old growth harvest to the next harvest is very different. A timber company is going to probably be more interested in a monoculture of same, if they're in their minds, they're like, we're growing corn.
And they showed us in Oregon, so Oregon Department of Fish and Game folks took us out and showed us some of the things and some of the challenges when we were at Leupold headquarters there. We did a little field trip, and they said, here on this land, they're actually doing aerial spraying to subdue the browse. The browse coming back, and then next to it would be a state thing, and you could see all the browse and stuff that was on
Right.
there.
Huh.
Yeah, because browse is competing with that early growth.
That's right.
Regen.
It makes total sense from a land management point, what their land management focus is.
Right. Yeah, it'd be kind of like saying, well, we would really expect a farmer to let a lot of native grasses grow in his cornfield.
Yeah.
No, he's there to get as much corn output from the input costs that he has. And it's just an annual cycle for him, whereas for timber companies, we're talking, 35 to 70 years of what that harvest cycle is. Creates a lot of unique challenges that.
Yeah, and it's not going to be that you can't just do one. It's all going to have to be very carefully designed and thought out. And to do population estimates of deer is incredibly challenging in that landscape. They're using DNA off of deer pellets.
Okay. Huh.
That transects off of that. In Oregon, they showed us they were using the DNA off of the deer pellets, but they had a dog trained, and they had contractors that would go into the clear cuts on the state land, and they would do transects, and the dog would go to the pellet, and then that guy could take pellet samples and put into a bag, and the dog would continue to do his work and stuff while he was out there. So the dog was finding deer poop.
Wow.
That's cool.
Up in, we've done it in Alaska. Todd Brinkman did that for his PhD on Prince of Wales Island, and he did 20, 25, 1 or 1,200 meter transects, and he went and removed all deer poop within 1 meter of that transect on both sides, then came back time after time and picked up what had fallen in that 2 meter wide swath that was 1,200 meters long. And he was able to get sex and individuals off of that as well and come up with an estimate of population. And he happened to do it during 2006 and 7, which were a terrible winter. Big snow loads.
Yeah.
And they persisted for a long time. And he actually recorded and through his work figured out that there was a 33% decline in the deer herd over those 2 winters.
Wow.
So he documented that winter mortality
Through pellets.
Yeah, that's
through the pellet work.
So before that, was there a way? What was how did they do population estimates? Is it just surveys like on the beach, or I guess
it would be they did counting deer pellets.
Okay.
So they had long established transects on the ground where they would do deer pellet transects.
Gotcha.
ADF&G would partner with the agency and volunteers and stuff. And I've done them before. And you go out there and you take a compass bearing and you go half a mile or a mile or whatever, and you count every little pile of poop along there. And if you do that year after year after year, you actually get some trend data.
Yeah.
But The other thing is habitat changes over time.
Oh,
And so
that's it.
some of those transects were in clear cuts. Well, after 15, 20 years, and especially if it had been commercially thinned, you weren't getting deer poop in there anymore.
Right.
You know, so there was changes to that. It wasn't a perfect system, but kind of Oregon actually brought Todd down to teach them how to do the deer poop thing from Alaska, because he was kind of the guy he figured out how to do it cheaply so you could get DNA quickly.
Wow.
So you can get individuals and sex. So you can have some kind of an idea of what the herd was like. I run 26 cameras, and I haven't moved them for 6 years, and I just count number of deer past the camera. And I think that kind of gives me a reasonable idea of where they're at. But like the presence or lack of wolves on the landscape changes how the deer move on the landscape. So if they don't come all the way down to where my cameras are, then I don't record them. You know, so that doesn't reflect really what the population is. That just reflects the fact that the wolves have been hammering that area.
Yeah. Because in your area, there is a migratory factor where they're going up to the alpine, or at least some group of the deer are going up to the alpine, and then they're coming back down to the lower country because of the winter's snow loads that just be.
But not all the population. So there's
Right.
there's a certain part of the population that stays relatively lower in the valley.
Yep.
So Sophie and I started this study when she was still at the University at Idaho. Now she's off working for a private NGO corporation. But we started this thing kind of in concurrence with Todd Brinkman up at the Fairbanks and the biology department up there, where the Forest Service went into a valley and they pretty much logged the slopes from the valley floor up to about 800 or 900 feet above the valley floor, but they left where the streams were kind of all together coming down into alluvial fan. They left these big leaf strips. And then they pre-commercially thinned these. So you have that huge slash load. Well, that forces the deer into those corridors, and we wanted to document the use of those corridors. So we had cameras in non-corridor areas and then in corridor areas. And I had it in my mind that there was a certain amount of deer kind of hung around, and then in the spring, as things greened up, there was a certain amount the population moved up the slope until the snow got deep enough to push them down. That's farthest from the truth.
Really?
I have daily the does and fawns bed 500 to 800 feet above the valley floor, whatever the elevation is, and they move down daily, usually in the night or late afternoon, to feed in the lower elevation and go back up to their bedding area.
Wow.
I would have never thought that, Randy.
Yeah.
Daily. I have huge daily movements. And then starting about October 12th, 14th, 15th, you start seeing spikes and forked horns on there. And so that's kind of kicking in. And somewhere about the 17th, 18th, 19th of October, this is all in the night, you start seeing that 2.5 to 4.5-year-old age class of bucks showing up on there. And then the rut goes crazy. And I go from 3 or 4 deer a day past a camera to 50 deer.
Wow.
Past. And so it really pushes. And then and then those bucks are coming down 15 minutes after the sun sets, and they're going back up past the camera 15 minutes before the sun rises.
Wow.
Until you get to a period that's about the 17th, 18th, 19th of November, when they start doing dumb things.
Yeah.
And I
Daylight
think the
hours.
big bucks then, so there's also a population that lives at higher elevation if they've not been pushed down by snow. And those bucks, those big, huge bucks that are up there, come down to make sure that everybody's been bred in the lower stuff. And that's when those guys that I've never seen show up.
Wow.
So in reality, there's about 3 days of the year you need to be in the woods. No, that's
If you want to hunt the dumb rutting bucks anyway.
the big dumb rutting bucks.
Yeah,
So you got to be
crazy.
there. There's about 3 days out of the year that you need to be there.
All right, I'll clear my calendar. For those 3 days.
But I mean, I never thought that you had the daily movement vertically. And if you combine that over these 26 cameras that are spread out over 2.5 miles, there's a lot of deer moving. So
Wow. Well, as they say, you learn something new every day.
every day.
Yeah.
The fact that the bucks have licking branches. They don't make a scrape, but the fact that they use these overhung hemlock branches at multiple trail intersections, and they mouth it and they rub that the gland between their antlers on there, their secretions and their preorbital gland on there, and they all move their feet and urinate.
Yeah. But
it's not one buck. I've got one of those stands. They'll have 12, 14 bucks using that thing, and they all come by and try to mark off everybody else's scent, you know. And I wouldn't have known that, but I went in a light snow, and here was all these tracks under this seemingly nothing little hemlock branch.
Yeah.
So now I've started looking for intersections, and I've hung cameras, and I've got maybe 6 of those I've got cameras on. I think there's way more vocalizations. I think there's way more physical, the scent thing going on than we have any idea of.
Wow. I think we got to go up there. I've never hunted them in the rut. It almost, just to use Jim Heffelfinger's experience of how he hunts, as he calls them, cows, deer in Arizona, you know, spot and stock. That's really how you're hunting the alpine Sitka Blacktails.
Right.
But when you're getting into the rut period, you're hunting them more like whitetails in the river bottoms.
Well, actually, some of the most exciting is the doe's brain doesn't quite shut off the save the fawn signal until she actually goes into estrus.
Okay.
So if you get in that chasing, or the end of the chasing phase, right up, so the licking branch thing, you get these 2.5 to 4.5-year-old bucks, and a few older bucks shows up October 22nd, 3rd, 4th, up to about the 7th through the 11th of November, and then they're gone, which means the first does come into heat and they're locked down on her somewhere, and they're no longer coming to that marking thing at all. If you can catch that in that 8th of November to 11th of November time slot, the doe's brain still says save the fawn.
Yeah.
And so you can do a fawn in distress call and call her in, and the buck thinks that she's running from him and he'll chase her in. Or he may be curious and come in on his own.
Yeah.
And that's what we tried with Jim, but the rut kicked in the day you guys flew away.
Right.
You
called in a few. You called in a few.
Yeah, but you hadn't landed in Seattle before I had one on the ground.
Right. Yeah.
I did a little video and I said, "This one's for you, Jim." I went to the morning they left. I hiked back in 4.5 miles. I walked into the first muskeg, blew on the call, and this beautiful little 3-point comes smoking out of the timber, and I shot him with a muzzleloader at like 20 yards.
He was just not wanting to put all that on camera, Mark.
Right. Yeah. It was still. I mean, like you called in a lot of does over that time frame. It was cool. But yeah. And we did see some bucks. We just never.
Yeah, I saw.
We just never got a shot at them.
I saw one like that.
Yeah.
And I was waiting to let Heffelfinger get the shot, and I should have just took it. I had him at 51 yards standing there broadside. And I thought he was going to take 2 or 3 steps forward, but Jim and Marcus were on the other side of the tree, and I think all of our scent like got cold, and I think it went down, and he walked into that, and he moonwalked backwards and turned, and you got 1/1000th of a second of frame.
Right, yeah, you barely can see him. But.
Yeah. Well, the podcast listener versus the podcast watcher, we're recording this for video for our YouTube channel. When Jim says one like that, he's referring to this Sitka Blacktail that he helped me take up in the Alpine. To get it officially scored, I had to strip the velvet.
Yep.
By the time the velvet was pretty much falling off anyhow, so that was no big deal. But in the mule deer world, people would be like, "Why'd you shoot that thing?" But for those who know Sitka Blacktails, when I posted a picture of this thing, when it had the velvet on it, it looked so much bigger. They're like, "What the heck? Where did you find that thing?" In fact, my uncles who live in Haines, Alaska, which is on the very, very north fringe, there's a few blacktails that make it up that far.
Very few.
I sent them a picture of me holding that with all the velvet. And in their colorful fisherman language, they replied back, "Where were you hunting to get that?" So that's when I really knew. I mean, I knew I had something special when we walked up to it, and you were just like, oh my gosh.
Yeah.
Oh my
it was
gosh.
like- I was like, dang it.
Yeah. That was pretty special. But another funny story about big blacktails in the southeast is you'd made reference earlier about a non-typical buck that we'd found. We were up bear hunting in 2015.
You and Bart.
Yeah, Bart May wanted to take him to Alaska because he'd never been to that part of Alaska. He'd been up to the interior where his brother lived. So we went on a bear hunt. Tyler Jonerson was the camera guy. And so Bart had shot a bear, and he's walking around the island somewhere, and he comes back to camp, and he says, oh, there's a little mule deer skeleton washed up over there on the beach. I'm like, well, they don't have mule deer here because Bart grew up in Salmon, Idaho, where everything's mule deer. And the next morning, he'd went over and he'd retrieved the skull and brought it back to camp, and it's sitting on a Yeti cooler. And I come out of my tent and I'm just floored. I'm like, oh my goodness. And Bart's like, well, what's the big deal? And then Tyler comes out of his tent, and Tyler's doing the jump up and down like I am. And we're like, Bart, that's the biggest blacktail we've ever seen. And he's like, oh, okay. Well, it was just laying over there. The skeleton's over there on the beach. So I walked over to where it was. I don't know if it winter killed and washed up or what had happened, but it had been there a long time because now, it's green moss growing on it, and the rodents had eaten all the ends off everything. So the plane comes to pick us up later that day, and we're loading the plane, and I'm going to push us off. I'm like, Bart, where's that dead head of that non-typical buck you found? Oh, I threw it in the brush over there back behind where your tent was. I'm like, what, you aren't bringing it? He's like, I don't have any use for that little thing. I'm like, you mind if I go grab it? He's like, go right ahead. It's over there. So I ran over there, grabbed it, brought it back, and I sent Jim a picture of it. And Jim, being an official Boone and Crockett scorer, I think your comment was something like my uncle's comment.
Pretty much.
Yeah. So when we got back to Montana, I called Keith Belford, who at the time was working for the Boone and Crockett Club over in Missoula. I'm like, hey, Keith, I think I have a pretty special blacktail here. Jim Baichtal told me to get this thing scored because he thinks it's way up there. So I brought it over to headquarters in Missoula, and Keith's response was like, holy smokes. Justin was working for him at the time, and they're like, where did you find this thing? So I told them this story about Bart throwing it in the brush. So I left it there for them to score, and it came back as the number 6 non-typical blacktail in the world after laying there for however long.
However long it been chewed on.
Yeah, and so much of it had been chewed up. I wonder how it would have performed if it had been.
It's really interesting, too, because just within a mile and a half of where that is, I've scored 3 bucks that were dead heads found on the beach that's made Boone and Crockett.
Really?
Wow.
I wonder if they are swimming out there and they
may be
swimming
because
current.
you know how that current is. That's super strong in there.
Yeah.
Like it'll take you right down the road.
Yeah, when you come past it, you could use a drift boat in there, but you're only going one way.
Yeah.
With the tide.
With the tide.
current. But so they called me and they're like, well, come and pick it up and we'll get it in the record book for you. And I'm like, look, it's a cool story, but it has no meaning for me. And so I donated it to the National Collection of, what do they call it?
Heads and Horns.
Heads and Horns. So now it sits in the
Springfield, Missouri, isn't it?
Is that where they put it?
I think
Okay.
so.
Yeah, that's right, because they invited me to Springfield for one of their events, and they said they were going to keep it at the museum of Johnny Morris has his big museum there at Bass Pro Shops. And so, that's where it is now. They're the proud owners of it, and that's how they should be. But, when I called Bart, I'm like, Bart, that buck that you threw in the brush is the number 6 non-typical in the world. He's like, what? I'm like, yeah, that's why Tyler and I were jumping around, hair on fire. But it's cool to know that those type of, whether it's age, genetics, quality of habitat, whatever it is, there's
timber management in that area, but not very much, and the habitat has been pretty good forever. Of course, now right in that area, the moose population is expanding so much.
Oh, really?
becoming really numerous out there. They came out of the Stikine River and has expanded out across Mitkoff and QU and Kupernoff Island.
Wow. So moose decided to swim from the mainland somewhere along the way.
Yep.
And get out there.
Yep.
I don't know why an animal would decide to swim out.
Of course, they can almost. There's a couple places you can almost walk across Rocky Pass.
Yeah. You'd have to dog paddle for a little bit. But,
At a slack tide.
Yeah.
yeah, definitely a slack tide, not a high tide. But no, it just was a cool thing to have that happen. Not that I did anything that I deserve any credit for
It's
it.
just an amazing thing to see that class of animal.
Yeah.
They're so few and far between. An absolute 4x4 with eye guards is like hen's teeth. There's a lot of 3x4s. There's a lot of just big forked horn blacktails.
Yeah.
They're not going to be anything but big forked horns,
Yeah.
But 3x4 is really common.
Yeah.
Interesting.
Well, then you get to the Columbia Blacktails, and a lot of mule deer guys, like Bart's a mule deer guy, he'd probably look at 150 or 60-inch Columbia Blacktail, which is super, super rare. I mean, that's really rare in the Columbia Blacktail world. And a mule deer person would probably be like, okay, yeah, nice buck, congratulations. Whereas the guy from Ashland, Oregon, would be jumping up and down and riding up and down Main Street with it on, with the tailgate down. So it's all relative to, where those species live.
I like the history. I like the fact that it was a geologic event that separated the Columbia.
Really? What was that?
The glaciation.
Okay.
That 2.5 million years of ice took whatever was the proto mule deer and isolated those populations where they became distinct. And
I mean, they do just have a completely different look to them.
Oh, yeah.
They're such a cool looking species.
and even,
Just like
even
how
physically
stocky they are.
between the Sitka and Columbia, there's a
even
almost every Sitka has a double white throat patch. And their tail is much different than a Columbia blacktail tail, and they just are like little Hereford bulls. I mean, they're short and stocky.
right? Yeah, yeah.
Well, a lot of people are probably going to say, I got to go do that someday. So where are you going to send them, Jim? You're going to send them up to Kodiak and say, don't come hunt them in my backyard. Go to Kodiak.
Exactly.
You did the Kodiak thing, Marcus.
It was cool. Yeah, we stayed at like a lodge, and they would drop you off each day for the hunt. I wouldn't do it that way again. It was an amazing experience to see everything.
What would you do? Go camp with the bears?
I would get dropped off. Just let me go, and I'll just backpack around until I kill one. Wow. No, I think there's a lot of really cool boat-based hunts. From Jim told me some good people to go with, or to check out. And then there's a lot of people that will do like they have a bigger boat that they kind of base out of, and then will drop you off on a beach every day, and then you can go sleep on the boat, kind of a deal. But I think it'd be a lot of fun just to get dropped off out there and backpack around until you kill one. You just got a few bears that you got to deal with and avoid while you're doing that.
Most of the guys you talk to who've done that say that it doesn't take long for the bears to figure out. I heard a gunshot. I'm going to get me some snacks for today. So you got to get that deer out of there in a hurry.
Right. Yeah. Once you have meat on the ground, I think that's when it becomes real. You got to really have a game plan of what you're going to do.
I know the folks that hunt over like elk on a fog neck. So they planted Roosevelt elk over there, and they're actually some of the biggest bodied Roosevelt elk on record. And they're like, you take all the meat with you.
Yeah, you're not coming back.
No, when they hunt in a pack, and they all grab the elk, and it's gone. They don't come back.
Yeah.
Or if they do, they've got ways of really hanging it, like in between trees, really high up.
Wow, I don't. I mean, I'm not going to fight a grizzly bear in Montana for my elk meat. No way am I going to fight,
coastal
brown bear for the meat. So whatever I can't haul, I guess, is a donation to the cause of
that is one nice thing about the Sitka Blacktail is it is a lot less meat than Roosevelt elk, for instance. Like you can actually carry a lot of it with you.
The average good 4.5-year-old mature buck that I get in my backpack when I bring it home, which I usually leave the bones in the rear ham and the front shoulder, and I'm somewhere like 72, 74 pounds, somewhere right in there. That's what
And
I
that's
had.
bone in on part of it.
Part of it bone in.
Yeah.
So boning out the back strap, taking all the ribs, all the neck meat, tenderloins, and then leaving the bones in the front shoulder and rear ham. That's
Right.
about 70. That's pretty consistent in there. Once in a while, I get one over 80.
Which, if you had a Roosevelt elk, could be that times 4 and a little more.
Yeah. I think, if I'm not mistaken, there was a bull that they documented that weighed like 1,200 pounds.
Yeah, those things are so crazy.
What's that? I can't. There's a wildlife trait that the more northern latitude animals get
The
bigger.
Bergman's principle or something.
Yeah, and so that definitely has applied that they've been there long enough.
Yeah.
Well, I don't apply in Alaska for elk. Between the stories I hear about those who hunt on, is it Raspberry, the other island?
Raspberry and Afognak, and then we've got elk right outside of Prince of Wales, over in Etland.
Right.
Etland and Zarembo.
Yeah, and I've talked to people. My buddy Corey Jacobson did that. And
I sent him a note, and in one picture you can see where Thorn Bay is right behind the ridge. I wrote him, I said, you should have come over for lunch. You know?
Yeah. Well, I don't need an elk as bad as it.
Did he tell you about packing that out?
Oh, man. Yeah,
Oh,
that's
yeah.
quite the experience. That's,
Yeah, I've watched.
And I know the lake he was in that's in a hole.
Yeah, he offered me to come with and be kind of the camp cook and like chief in charge of BS, and I declined. I'm like, Corey, I have hunted enough of Southeast Alaska with family living up there and other stuff. I don't. You don't have enough lover money to get me to join you on that.
I've
trip.
archery hunted that twice.
Yeah,
But
no thanks. But he did see some really big deer on that hunt. He showed me some pictures of some deer that he saw. But I don't got to worry about me.
yeah.
I'm not competition for those tags. If anyone.
yeah, and that's all
that.
that's that South Edelin Wilderness stuff
Yeah.
down in there. It's a big area. And actually, I think it's pretty well documented now that the coastal brown bear have made it out to Etland, and they're just starting to show up out there.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah. Well, keep them off Prince of Wales.
see, well, the last fossil one we have is 7,200 years ago. Of course, that probably wasn't the last one, but that's the last record we have of brown bear on Prince of Wales
Wow.
out of the caves.
Well, I don't really. I mean, it's nice to hunt some of those islands where it's like, okay, I don't got to worry about a 12-footer. Well, that might be an exaggeration. A 10-footer coming in messing with me because he can have my tent, he can have my sleeping bag, he can have everything he wants. I'm not going to put up a fight.
I was camping. I can tell you what doesn't survive your jet boil when they decide to bite the jet boil container.
Oh, the
Gas.
gas.
Well, he
Or
did.
the-
He did that. He first bit the gas, which I had one of the big ones on the bottom of the jet boil.
Yeah.
He bit a hole in that, and it was brand new.
Oh, no.
I had not used that jet boil,
Oh,
and he
man.
got the full thing. Then he grabbed my container.
Boom. Just like,
And
Yeah.
I sent a picture to Jet Boil, and the lady, the customer service, immediately got a hold of me. She says, I've sent this to everybody. She goes, do you need a new container? And I go, I was going to order one. She goes, no, we're sending you one.
Nice. That's awesome.
Oh, my gosh.
well, Jim, it'll be exciting to see where the Blacktail Deer Foundation goes now that it has the infrastructure and the benefits of an already existing organization like the Mule Deer Foundation. And is there a place people should contact if they're interested? Do they go to the Mule Deer Foundation?
You can go to the
website?
Mule Deer Foundation webpage and find it. You can go to blacktail.org.
Blacktail.org, huh?
I believe so.
All right. Well, if not, if they Google Blacktail Deer Foundation,
It'll
Marcus,
take it right to it.
There you go.
Marcus always says what? Google is your friend.
So I'll Google. I'll have to Google that to,
Yeah.
Yeah,
it's funny, Marcus having his undergrad in fish and wildlife, he's our fish and wildlife resource here in the office. And so many times we're like, Marcus, what's the answer to this? And he'll say, I know, I got to Google
I got to
that.
Google it.
Yeah.
And I think they've got it up.
Can't just
I
pull
think they've got
everything
it up
from
now
memory.
with several different membership levels and stuff like that.
Okay.
And we, I
You'll,
think it's $35 a year.
yeah. You'll accept volunteers also, right?
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah. Yeah. Jim will, if you volunteer, Jim will tell you where you can go climb in a cave and dig out beaver skulls. Because one time he drugged me to the front of a cave, me and Sophie and Tyler. No, it was me and you and Sophie, because I think Marcus and Tyler, it was that day they went out trying to kill that big buck.
Right, yeah.
And
we went over and filled up our water.
Yeah. And then we climbed up to this great big cave you knew of, and you guys drug out some beaver skulls and bones. And
so we must have been at 1,900 feet in elevation, and this cave is in the side of a cliff. And so then I had to kind of climb down into the entrance down in there. And I looked, and here's this pile of bones, and it's not a juvenile. It is a somewhat, young age adult beaver. Like, why would that beaver be
at that elevation?
At that elevation. And so the water comes out of that cave system, goes out across the reason we camped there, across that meadow, and then goes into a vertical pit. So they don't even have, like, water to follow up.
Right. Yeah. He had to have been on an adventure.
Yeah.
Or something killed it and drug it up there. But
that's what I'm thinking. Something had to kill that thing and drug it somewhere. But why would you not just eat it down, on the riverbank at 200 feet elevation?
Yeah, I don't know.
Either that or he's just a
There's a story that you could, I don't know.
So I just say there's an update on that. So the Blacktail Deer Foundation is blacktail.org, and they now have the life member.
There you go. Blacktail Deer Life Membership.
Yep.
Blacktaildeer.org.
Blacktaildeer.org.
Okay, not blacktail.org.
Blacktaildeer.org.
Blacktaildeer.org. Yep. All right. Well, folks, I hope you guys enjoyed this conversation. We always enjoy when we have Jim around. In fact, he's here in Montana, and you made the loop. You were over doing a podcast with our buddies at Meat Eater.
Yep, that was fun yesterday.
Yeah, and then we're going to impose.
I got Cal wanting to come up and bring his flintlock and try the flintlock in the rainforest.
Yeah.
Sounds like not a recipe for success.
Yeah.
I'm at about 95% ignition.
Okay.
I've got a couple clutches under my belt.
I imagine that takes some diligence of keeping things dry, though.
Yeah.
Boy, I so admire those first trappers that used like the Voyagers and those that had those French fusel fins and stuff. That was the smooth bore 20 gauge. Mm-hmm. That they relied on that for life and safety and food and every other thing, and making that baby go off no matter what the weather was.
Yeah. The guy could have learned a trick or two from those folks.
Yeah. Actually, I read their journals, and they used a wool bag.
Really?
And that and a couple other little tricks that I've picked up, that I just keep that gun in a wool bag. There's no snap shooting. Like, you've got to be conscious about what you're doing.
You better have good follow through.
Yeah. You can ask my wife sometime about the first time I took it deer hunting, and there was a fork and horn in his bed, and I belly crawled up there and went thud, and it didn't do anything. And I looked, and so now I don't ever do this. I'd actually prime the pan. I don't prime the pan until I'm ready to shoot now.
Yeah.
I wiped it out, and I reamed it out, and I laid it in there, and I did it 3 clatches, big white smoke puff. Finally, the buck is up and looking at me like, what the heck is going on behind that stump? And then on the 5th try, it went off.
Jeez.
And did you get him?
And I got him.
It'd be hard to hold steady at that point.
I know. Yeah. Oh, no. Like the follow-through in my brain, I was imagining the ball slowly going towards the deer and passing through it. And Karen walked up and like, what were you doing? I said, educating myself.
Yeah. Well, folks, thanks for tagging along with us here. Thanks for listening. I know I've been delinquent in getting a lot of these podcasts out due to travel, due to trade show season, due to one I had an equipment failure, and it's pretty hard to send a podcast to an editor when you didn't record it properly. And then just case of pneumonia. Marcus, you and I had an elk hunt in Wyoming, and we had a deer hunt in Arizona that had a lot of interference to the podcast schedule. So appreciate you joining us, Jim. And
this was fun.
Yeah, and
for a good cause. I am so excited about the potential of where this organization could go.
Yeah, wow. I'm glad that Leupold held you guys or hosted you guys at a big conference, because this is Leupold's Hunt Talk Radio. That is, I mean, we would have done this even if it wasn't Leupold's Hunt Talk Radio, but I guess the point of bringing that up is a lot of the companies in our industry, at least a handful of them, do a lot of these things related to conservation, and they don't do it for any reason other than they're as vested in conservation as all of us are who hunt. So glad that was one of the origins of the Blacktail Deer Group.
I also, we got to go through the plant and meet the employees and how vested the employees are in making that scope that I carry in the woods. Yeah. And that came across by every single person that we met. Yeah. I know you've been there many times, and you know exactly what I'm talking about. Those people love that company.
Yeah.
And I think about that when I look through those crosshairs on my dad's old .6.
Yeah. Yeah, it's quite impressive to have 700 and some people working in Beaverton, Oregon, to do that. And when you go there, most of them have been there. Oh, yeah, I've been here 28 years. And, you know, you find some new person who's only been there 12. Like, he's not.
I'm the newbie.
Yeah, the new guy. But anyhow, folks, thanks for tagging along with us. Thanks for listening. And we'll start rolling out a bunch of these. And if you get a chance, go to blacktaildeer.org or Google it. And you'll be there and become a supporter, because all the things we love, the wild places and the wild things, need our support, whether it's our money, our volunteerism, and we can never give too much. So thank you, Jim. Thanks, Marcus. Appreciate you guys being here.